昔、ポケモンと人間の境が曖昧だった頃。
Mythology, folklore, tales of otherworldly creatures, Japanese monsters, spirits, and ghouls, commonly known as yokai. Much like in the Pokemon world, in real-world Japan, there was a time in history where the line between humans and yokai was vague and blurred. It's been well known for many years now that many Pokemon draw some level of inspiration from Japanese yokai. Frostlass being based on the Yuki Onna, Poltergeist and its counterparts being inspired by Tsukumogami, just to name a few. But how about Typhlosion? The Generation 2 Firestarter has found itself in a bit of controversy following the recent Terror Leak incident that has taken over Twitter. A lore background story of dubious nature written by a Pokemon Company employer was found, thrown into a machine translator, and spread like forest fire, making Typhlosion an instant meme, a target of ridicule, which resulted in even its fans and fan artists finding themselves at the receiving end of tormenting comments. But is this story really as bad as what it's made out to be? Can the reputation of Typhlosion be redeemed? Or is the Johto Firestarter beyond saving? Before continuing on with this video, I would like to quickly issue a few warnings. This video may briefly touch on some adult topics. Additionally, this video does cover a small amount of cut content. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, dropping a comment, sharing your opinions, and subscribing. I make a lot of content focusing on Japanese to English translations for Pokemon, including leaks, rumors, and media, as well as content relating the Pokemon world to real-world Japan. So as mentioned earlier, many Pokemon, especially Pokemon from the Japanese-inspired regions, Kanto, Johto, Hoenn, Sinnoh, and even Hisui and Kitakami, have many Pokemon who are inspired by Japanese yokai. Some are very obvious, while some are less so. This is the case for the Typhlosion line, which draws inspiration from a specific type of yokai called Mujina. Mujina are shape-shifting yokai resembling badgers. They are quite similar to the much more commonly known Tanuki yokai, sharing many similar abilities and lore. Mujina are also known to create and control Tanuki-bi, which are basically Will-O-Wisps, or Ghost Fire. This does fit with Johtonian Typhlosion, but even more so with Hisuian Typhlosion due to its Ghost Fire typing. Now, let's move on to the story that everybody is talking about. Just to note, for brevity's sake, I won't be covering the story word for word, more so focusing on certain points of interest and how they relate to real-world yokai lore. The text starts out like most folklore stories do, calling back to an undefined time long past.
昔、ポケモンと人間の境が曖昧だった頃。
This, in my opinion, sets this up as a classic fairy tale story. The story then progresses to set up the main protagonist, the location, and the setting.
その村の少女が山へ薪を集めに出かけた。
This line is very important, particularly the word shoujo. The Japanese word shoujo translates to young woman or girl. Nowadays, in the modern Japanese world, most people would consider females between the age range of around 13 to about 20 to be shoujo. So the misinterpretation of this as only possibly meaning young girl, whereas young lady would have been more accurately vague, caused a lot of initial confusion and understandable outrage. The actual age of the girl is not specified. We know that the girl was at least old and mature enough to be sent on the journey to travel to collect firewood by herself, a task that surely wouldn't have been given to a younger girl due to safety fears. It's also worth considering the time period that this myth is likely set in. The story goes on to explain how she continued to venture further into the forested mountain before she noticed some excrement, which she recognized specifically as Typhlosion excrement, implying that Typhlosion must be common in the area. This further connects Typhlosion to Mujina, as Mujina were most commonly said to live in forests and mountains. At this point, a Typhlosion who had shape-shifted into the form of a human man appears before the protagonist and offers her shelter. The Typhlosion and the protagonist eventually arrive at the Typhlosion's cave. The Typhlosion goes to gather food to share with the girl. The hunting and provision of food may relate to Mujina's kind natures. Although they are known as tricksters who enjoy playing pranks, a common hobby among many types of yokai, Mujina are also sometimes thought to be kind-hearted. After eating, before they go to sleep, he says to her,
僕より先に目が覚めても僕の顔を見ないでくれよ。
This might seem like an odd request, but it makes sense, especially if you compare the Typhlosion to a shape-shifting Mujina. While sleeping, it may become more difficult to control its powers and retain the illusion of human form. Although while skilled and able to shapeshift into multiple forms, the Mujina's ability to shapeshift is said to not always be stable. Additionally, a particular form that Mujina are known to shapeshift into is that of a faceless man. Perhaps this is because facial features tend to be more detailed and require more effort. We see as the story continues that the girl did in fact wake up before the man, but she kept her promise and did not look at his face before she eventually fell back to sleep. This implies that the Typhlosion retained the shape of a human body, whereas his human face was probably either blank or returned to its natural state. On the next night, he repeated the same words, instructing her not to look at his sleeping face.
僕より先に目が覚めても僕の顔を見ないでくれよ。
At this point, the girl expressed concern and desire to return to her family in the village. The man yawned and tapped her on the head, causing her to forget all of her concerns. It's just a shame that this part of the story does not fit with either Jotonian's or Hisuian's Typhlosion's moveset, which both do not include the moves yawn or amnesia. The story then implies that a considerable time passes. Seasons change and the protagonist somehow realizes that the man is in fact a Typhlosion. The Typhlosion expresses his desire to remain hidden from humans.
ダメだよ。もっと高い木の枝でなければ人間に見つかってしまう。
Showing the Mujina nature of being wary and shy of humans. The Typhlosion had asked for a certain type of branch. Perhaps the intention of this was to create a stronger fire and smoke in order to provide better coverage during the winter months. Even Typhlosion's black and white Pokédex entry mentions its penchant of hiding. It attacks using blasts of fire. It creates heat shimmers with intense fire to hide itself. More time is said to have passed until
ある日に目覚めると少女は一人の子供を抱いていた。
This happens rather suddenly in the story. There was no previous mentioning of a relationship, pregnancy, or even a solid concept of how much time had passed. Furthermore, the idea of a child born from humans and yokai is not uncommon, although it is more commonly a yokai wife and a human husband. We even have written in-game canon lore in regards to marriage between humans and Pokemon, although it differs a bit between the Japanese original and English localization. A book in the Conclave library reads,
人と結婚したポケモンがいた。ポケモンと結婚した人がいた。昔は人もポケモンも同じだったから普通のことだった。
whereas the English localization changed the story quite significantly, totally removing the aspect of marriage. There once were Pokemon that became very close to humans. There were once humans and Pokemon that ate together at the same table. It was a time when there existed no differences to distinguish the two. To further build on this history of humans and Pokemon being read, in Pokemon Legends Arceus, there is a side quest, Traces of a Lost Village, where you search for pieces of a journal which detail a relationship between a Frostlass and a human. This is a reference to many stories of Yuki-onna, the Ice Lady yokai. But it seems that during the passage of time, the father of the protagonist has been searching for her and is getting closer and closer. The Typhlosion exclaims, he must fight because he cannot return her, as she is now his wife. The protagonist begs the Typhlosion not to harm her father. The words she used,
あなた、いい人です。
stand out in particular. This implies that although she knows the man is a Typhlosion, she still thinks of the two of them as not being different from one another. To her, he is a person. Once again, perhaps alluding to the kinder spirit of Mujina, the Typhlosion agreed and they went to sleep. However, the next day, the protagonist's father was coming closer to the cave. When the protagonist returned from checking outside,
爆風は歌っていた。聞いたことのない歌だった。
he tells her that if he is to perish, she must follow a set of instructions and sing this song. The singing is in reference to the Mujina habit of taking human form to sing songs. Once again, it's unfortunate that sing or perish song are not part of the Typhlosion moveset. Distraught, the girl begs the Typhlosion and declares that rather than her father, she hopes Typhlosion will perish instead.
さよなら。二度と会うこともない。
Are the final words as Typhlosion departs. Witnessing the end of the battle and the end of Typhlosion, the protagonist exclaimed to her father,
私は今まで彼と暮らしてきました。彼は私の夫です。夫の爆風の目と心と声を私にください。
referring to Typhlosion as Otto, meaning husband, showing that in some way at some point she had accepted the Typhlosion as her partner. The father then went on to build a home for his daughter and her child, but the treatment towards them from the villagers was severe, with the villagers even trying to force the protagonist and her child to wear the fur of Typhlosion.
私たちをからかわないように村の人たちに言ってください。あの皮をかぶればきっと私たちは爆風になってしまいます。もう今だって半分爆風なのです。
This implies that by this point, not only was the child half Typhlosion, but the protagonist had also somehow become half Pokemon herself. But alas, the cruel treatment continued until suddenly the girl and the child let out a loud roar before retreating into the forest.
そういうことがあって人々は知った。爆風は半分人間なのだ。
So having taken note of all the points above, it's clear that there are many ties between the yokai Mujina and Typhlosions. The story does read very much like a classical yokai folklore story. And as mentioned several times, the idea of relationships between yokais and humans are not thought of as uncommon or odd, just like how there is old text in canon Pokemon games also stating that relationships between Pokemon and humans was once considered normal. We must keep in mind that this story, as it was written to resemble a yokai folklore story, should be read as a story that was written many centuries ago about a story that was said to happen even further back than that time. Additionally, it seems like this particular story also takes additional inspiration from the story The Bear Mother, a Canadian First Nation mythology story. I do not know much about this story myself, but it seems to follow a very similar pattern to this story. I do recommend searching for it online if you would like to see the comparisons. But this also brings up the fact that folklore stories with darker themes and darker endings don't exist purely in Japanese mythology, but also many other areas of the world as well. Another popular example of this would be the fairy tale story of the Little Mermaid. If you don't already know, let's just say that the original fairy tale does not end as happily as the Disney movie. Lastly, I think another important factor we need to keep in mind is that this story is basically cut content. This story was indeed created by a Game Freak employee, but no part of this particular story has ever made it into any Pokemon game, nor has the Pokemon Company told it in any official publicized media. In my opinion, this means it cannot technically be considered canon. We should not let this cut content story affect the way we view Typhlosion. Anyway, let me know, what do you think? Has learning about yokai folklore and Mujina helped you better understand this story? I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. But for now, it's time to say bye bye. Mate ne!